Think medieval knights lived a life of glory and honor? Think again. The reality was far less glamorous. In fact, more medieval soldiers died from camp diseases like dysentery and typhus than in actual combat. Forget the image of heroic sword fights. Most soldiers faced a daily struggle against filth, exhaustion, and the constant threat of sickness. Even minor injuries could turn deadly, with infected wounds claiming more lives than enemy blades ever did. Archaeologists have found skeletons at places like Stirling Castle showing repeated head fractures and signs of chronic hardship, not chivalry. In this video, we'll show you what it really meant to be a medieval soldier, starting with the everyday misery that defined their existence. For a medieval soldier, daily life meant enduring filth, discomfort, and constant exposure to disease. The reality was harsh. Most soldiers slept on bare earth or on rushes that had not been changed in months, if ever. These bedding materials, often recovered by archaeologists near sites like Stirling Castle, were infested with fleas and lice, making hygiene nearly non-existent. The cold ground offered little protection from the weather, and when it rained, mud quickly seeped into everything. Soldiers woke up shivering, clothes damp, and skin itchy from the vermin that thrived in these conditions. Sanitation in the camps was almost entirely absent. Waste from both people and animals accumulated around living areas, with open pits or ditches serving as makeshift latrines, often placed dangerously close to where soldiers ate and slept. The stench was inescapable, and the ground itself became a breeding ground for disease. Floor rushes, rarely replaced, trapped filth for weeks or months, worsening the already dire situation. Exposure to such an environment meant that even minor wounds could become infected, and any illness spread rapidly among the tightly packed ranks. Outbreaks of disease were common and deadly. Dysentery and typhoid regularly diminished fighting strength, sometimes sidelining half an army before a single arrow was fired. Chroniclers described how, during Henry III's 172-day siege of Kenilworth, disease swept through the encampment, leaving many too weak to fight. Medieval medical sources confirmed that more soldiers died from these camp illnesses than from enemy weapons. The lack of basic hygiene, soap, or clean water meant that there was little anyone could do to prevent illnesses once it took hold. It wasn't only the soldiers who suffered. During the Crusades and other long campaigns, many brought their families along, wives, children, even elderly relatives, hoping their presence would offer some comfort. Eckhard of Ararak recorded how Crusader households traveled with all their belongings, exposing everyone to the same dangers. Children played in mud and waste, while spouses tried to keep clothes in repair and food on the table, all in the midst of squalor. The entire camp became a community at risk, and disease or starvation claimed lives indiscriminately. Clothing offered little protection. Soldiers wore the same tunic and trousers for weeks or months on end, with no change of clothes and no way to wash what they had. Lice and fleas lived in every seam, and even if a soldier managed to pick them off, they would return by nightfall. The constant itching and discomfort became part of daily life. Infected wounds, rashes, and sores were common, and the absence of soap or clean water meant that even the smallest scratch could become a serious threat. Privacy was non-existent. Soldiers slept side by side, packed into barns, or huddled in open fields. The air was thick with the sounds of coughing, snoring, and groaning as men battled stomach cramps from spoiled foods or illnesses. Rats and other vermin scurried between bedrolls, and when rain fell, everyone and everything was soaked. The mud clung to boots and clothing, hardening into a crust that was impossible to remove. Exposure to the elements claimed many lives, and for those who survived, the misery was unending. The camp itself was a scene of chaos. Soldiers drank whatever alcohol they could find, sometimes fighting among themselves or scavenging for food in nearby villages. The lack of order made it impossible to control the spread of disease. If one person fell ill, the sickness would move quickly through the camp, infecting dozens within days. There was no effective treatment or quarantine, just a hope that you wouldn't be next. Despite all this, soldiers were still expected to be ready for battle at a moment's notice. Many never made it that far. Death from exposure, disease, or infected wounds was common, and often went unrecorded because it happened away from the battlefield. Medieval chroniclers and medical texts agree. For most soldiers, the real danger was not the enemy, but the conditions they endured every day. These hardships didn't just sap morale, they weakened bodies and made everyone more vulnerable for whatever came next. And when hunger set in, the struggle for survival became even more desperate. For most medieval soldiers, the daily struggle extended to the food they ate, or more often, couldn't eat. Feeding an army was rarely a priority, and the responsibility for finding food fell squarely on each man's shoulders. Charlemagne ordered each soldier to carry 3 months' worth of food, yet campaigns still ran out, forcing men to ration to gruel or salted meat that cured hunger more than nourished bodies. Supplies packed at home disappeared quickly on the road, and there was rarely a backup plan. The standard fare was basic and repetitive: stale bread, if it hadn't molded, and salted meat that was tough and overly brined. Soldiers chewed on these rations for days or weeks, sometimes mixing in a thin, watery porridge made from whatever grain was available. This food was bland and offered little energy. Fresh fruits and vegetables were almost never available, especially on long marches or in the field, which meant vitamin deficiencies were common. Scurvy, known for causing swollen gums and aching joints, was not just a sailor's disease. Land armies suffered the same fate. Weakness and slow healing from wounds became the norm. Sieges brought the most severe shortages. Cut off from outside supplies, both soldiers and civilians inside fortress walls faced the slow grind of hunger. The 172-day siege of Kenilworth is a clear example. Defenders and attackers alike ran out of food, with rations shrinking until even basic sustenance was gone. In these conditions, people boiled leather from boots or belts to make a thin broth, hoping to stave off starvation for another day. The absence of food was a deliberate tactic. Starvation was as much a weapon as the sword or arrow. When armies moved, they left a trail of empty villages and pillaged farms. Relying on looting became standard practice once official supplies ran out. But looting was unpredictable. Sometimes there was nothing left to take, especially if locals had already fled or hidden their stores. Even when something was found, it was often contaminated or spoiled. Eating hastily gathered grain or poorly cooked meat introduced new illnesses, compounding the misery. When rations ran out, armies resorted to looting. But even that could bring contaminated food and disease, compounding the soldier's misery. Malnutrition affected every part of a soldier's life. A diet lacking in key nutrients left men weak and unable to recover from even minor wounds. An infected scratch from ill-fitting armor could become deadly when the body lacked the resources to fight infection. Hunger made soldiers less effective in combat, more prone to illness, and slower to react to danger. The lack of proper food didn't just sap energy, it destroyed morale and discipline, turning hungry men into a risk for commanders who needed order on the battlefield. The unpredictability of food supplies meant that even the best laid plans could fall apart. Charlemagne's 3-month rule was rarely enforced, and logistical failures were common. Marches stretched longer than expected, battles delayed resupply, and bad weather ruined what little food was available. Every campaign carried the risk that hunger would strike before the enemy did. During sieges, the situation often became desperate. Some accounts mention soldiers scraping together makeshift meals from whatever they could find, boiling shoe leather, chewing on roots, or surviving on thin gruel stretched as far as possible. These measures were not just about discomfort, they were about survival. Starvation weakened entire armies long before the fighting ended. The health consequences were severe: weakened bodies, increased disease, and high death rates from causes that had nothing to do with combat. For the average soldier, there was no glory in the daily fight for food. The lack of nutrition made every other hardship worse, from disease to exhaustion to the threat of injury. And when it came time to face the enemy, many soldiers were already at a disadvantage, their bodies and spirits worn down by hunger. Even with the daily struggle for food, soldiers still had to rely on their equipment to survive the battlefield. But the sword, shield, and armor that were supposed to protect them often brought their own set of problems. Weapons and armor were supposed to offer protection and give a soldier a fighting chance. In reality, these tools brought their own dangers and often failed when it mattered most. The type and quality of equipment a soldier had depended almost entirely on what he could afford. Most foot soldiers made do with whatever they could find or buy: patched leather jerkins, old chainmail, or sometimes nothing but thick clothing. Only those with wealth could afford full chainmail, or even rare plate armor. The divide between the well-equipped and the poorly equipped was stark, and it often meant the difference between life and death. Armor itself came with serious drawbacks. Medieval military treatise and records show that full suits of armor could weigh over 100 pounds. Even seasoned fighters struggled under this burden. becoming exhausted before fighting even began. Helmets with vision slits might shield a soldier's face, but they also made it hard to see and react to danger. For many, armor was as much an obstacle as it was a safeguard. It slowed movement, limited agility, and made it almost impossible to get up if knocked down in the chaos of battle. Weapons were just as unreliable. The sword, so often idealized, was an expensive item and not always well made. Poorly forged blades often cracked under stress, leaving a soldier unarmed in the chaos. As medieval sources note, spears, while cheaper and easier to make, could break when thrust against armor or lost in the press of bodies. Many soldiers, especially those from lower ranks, fought with whatever they could find: sharpened farming tools, axes, or even sturdy sticks. These makeshift weapons were no match for real armor and often left their wielders exposed. The violence of medieval combat was direct and brutal. Battles were not elegant contests, but crowded, frenzied clashes where everyone tried to survive. Blades rarely sliced cleanly through armor. Instead, they glanced off, bent, or shattered, forcing soldiers to use whatever was at hand. The evidence is clear in the remains found at sites like Stirling Castle. One skeleton there bore 44 separate skull fractures and 60 body blows, proof of the relentless and messy nature of these fights. These injuries were rarely clean or instantly fatal. Most wounds were deep, jagged, and often left survivors with permanent damage. Surviving a battle did not mean safety. Even a minor wound could become lethal in a few days. Medical knowledge was basic, and the treatments available were crude. When a limb had to be amputated, surgeons often cauterized the wound with boiling pitch, a method that was as painful as it was dangerous. Infection set in quickly, and without antibiotics or proper sanitation, even small injuries could lead to sepsis or death. Soldiers who survived the initial violence often died slowly from wounds that festered and spread infection throughout their bodies. The aftermath of battle left many with lifelong scars, both visible and hidden. Some returned home with missing limbs, limited mobility, and constant pain. Others carried the psychological effects of what they had seen and endured. For those who could no longer fight or work, there was little support. Many ended up begging or relying on charity, their injuries serving as reminders of the harshness of medieval warfare. The reality for most soldiers was that the struggle did not end when the fighting stopped. The dangers of poor equipment, unreliable weapons, and inadequate medical care followed them long after the battlefields emptied. The promise of glory was often replaced by a daily fight for survival, leaving little room for the heroism so often celebrated in stories. The life of a medieval soldier was anything but glorious. Behind every campaign, soldiers faced a daily contest with hunger, disease, and exhaustion that shaped their lives more than any battle. Filthy camps, meager rations, and unreliable weapons set the stage for hardship long before fighting began. Historical estimates show camp disease and starvation claimed more lives than pitched battles, underscoring that simple survival was the real victory for most. Next time you hear stories of chivalrous knights, remember that without proper food, gear, or medicine, most medieval soldiers didn't live to see glory. If you found these brutal truths eye-opening, consider subscribing for more myth-busting history.